70 years ago, the world faced the very real risk of nuclear confrontation in a period of brinksmanship over islands off the coast of China. And that conflict defined unresolved issues that still risk war in the Far East today and resulted in a remarkable but little remembered naval operation that was dramatically called Operation King Kong, which then went on to redefine Chinese cuisine in New York City. The 1955 confrontation over the Taiwan Islands deserves to be remembered. While most of the world saw the Second World War as the great conflict of its day, to the Chinese it was merely a continuation of the Second Sino Japanese War, which was itself essentially an interruption of the Chinese Civil War. By 1950, the Communist Red Army had largely driven the nationalist forces from the mainland and declared China a People's Republic. The nationalists on the island of Taiwan continued to claim to be the legitimate government of the nation as the Republic of China. China had been constantly at war for 23 years. Conflicts had, by some estimates, killed as many as 20 million. And the conflict was not over. In the aftermath of the ROC retreat, the PRC arrested millions of people to purge nationalist supporters and anyone whose loyalty was suspect, and executed hundreds of thousands. China also invaded and annexed the independent state of Tibet, killing or imprisoning at least tens of thousands more. Meanwhile, a nationalist insurgency continued from Burma, quietly supported by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. The United States at first tried to broker a peace deal, sending General George C. Marshall as its special envoy, but failing that, had taken a more hands-off approach. Still, the U.S. continued to recognize the ROC as the only legitimate government of all of China, and that is likely what prevented a PRC assault on Taiwan. While President Truman officially held the position that the U.S. would not involve itself in the Civil War, Professor of Political Science at Virginia Commonwealth University William Newman explained on the Foreign Affairs website, War on the Rocks, that the Truman policy was still deterrence, with the Secretary of State Dean Acheson giving a speech to the National Press Club in January of 1950, in which he argued that although an attack on Taiwan would not lead to U.S. intervention, it would trigger the commitments of the entire civilized world under the Charter of the United Nations. With the outbreak of war in Korea, Truman feared that the Red Army would take advantage of the distraction to invade Taiwan and sent the U.S. Seventh Fleet to the Taiwan Strait, releasing a statement on June 27, 1950. The attack upon Korea makes it plain beyond all doubt that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war. It has defied the orders of the Security Council of the United Nations issued to preserve international peace and security. In these circumstances, the occupation of Formosa by communist forces would be a direct threat to the security of the Pacific area and to United States forces performing their lawful and necessary functions in that area. Accordingly, I have ordered the Seventh Fleet to prevent any attack on Taiwan. Despite the supposed commitment of the entire civilized world, the U.S. was shouldering the responsibility, trying simultaneously to deter an attack by the PRC on Taiwan while trying to deter ROC forces from provocative action on the mainland. Meanwhile, the PRC was receiving such help from the Soviet Union that the ROK complained to the United Nations that the Soviets were violating the 1945 Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, earning the Soviet Union a condemnation from the United Nations in 1952. While active fighting had largely ended in 1949, no peace treaty or agreement between the PRC and the ROC had been signed, and the Taiwan Strait remained a dangerous front in the Cold War conflict between the Western nations and communism, which constantly threatened to heat up the Cold War. The ROC continued to claim to be the sole legitimate government of all of China, and the U.S. was as concerned about the ROC provoking conflict by invading the mainland as they were that the PRC would attack Taiwan. That issue became even more explosive. The ROC held several islands or archipelagos off the coast of China, and in 1954 the ROC started to move troops to and fortify these islands. The PRC responded by bombarding the islands, with the ROC largely unable to stop the air attacks, despite taking light casualties themselves. This placed the United States in a difficult position. The U.S. and the Eisenhower administration responded by signing a mutual defense pact with the ROC, affirming the U.S. position that the ROC was the sole legitimate government of all of China, and pledging that the U.S. would defend Taiwan if it were attacked. But the pact sought to restrain the ROC as well, and specified that the U.S. would not defend the islands of Quemoy and Matsu, nor the Taiwan Islands, and that the U.S. would not aid in any attempt to retake the mainland. Moreover, the Office of the Historian of the Secretary of State explains the situation in the Strait deteriorated in late 1954 and early 1955, prompting the U.S. government to act. In January 1955, the U.S. Congress passed the Formosa Resolution, which gave President Eisenhower total authority to defend Taiwan and the offshore islands. The ROC and PRC were facing each other across the strait, and the U.S. was poised to go to war. Newman noted that Eisenhower was committed to the use of America's full military power to defend Taiwan, meaning he was prepared to use nuclear weapons. Called the First Taiwan Strait Crisis, risk of war was very real. Historian Gordon Chang of Stanford University wrote in a 1988 edition of the Journal of International Security, newly available documentary evidence shows that Eisenhower actually brought the country to the nuclear brink far closer to war than a distraught public feared in 1955. Closer than Eisenhower acknowledged in his own memoirs, and closer than most historians have heretofore even suspected. Notable among the evidence that Chang cites is that, despite the specifications of the treaty, he was in fact prepared to defend the islands of Quemoy and Matsu using nuclear weapons if necessary. This position put the U.S. at odds with most of its allies and threatened those relationships. Chang writes, in Eisenhower's own recollection, the crisis almost caused a split between the United States and nearly all its allies. However, the U.S. position was supported by Australia. By January 1955, war seemed nearly inevitable. Chang writes, in spite of the administration's efforts, the situation in the Taiwan Strait continued to deteriorate in late 1954, and in Eisenhower's description, took a turn for the worse at the start of 1955. Both the communists and the nationalists predicted imminent widespread hostilities. From Washington's vantage point, all-out war for the offshore islands, and perhaps Taiwan itself, seemed to loom. The current battle line was the Taiwan Islands, an archipelago that allowed the nationalists to threaten shipping lanes along the Chinese coast. While Eisenhower was willing to defend Quemoy and Matsu, his position on the Taiwan Islands was less clear. Meanwhile, a PRC bombing attack destroyed the island's reservoir, making it impossible for the nationalists to hold out in the long run. The 1955 edition of Keesing's Record of World Events, a summary of world news, explained, following repeated and heavy Chinese Communist air attacks on the Taiwan Islands, the Chinese nationalist government announced on February 6 that the islands were to be evacuated. The announcement stated that the evacuation had been decided upon in order to meet the new challenge of international communist aggression, and so that the forces defending the Taichans could be redeployed to strengthen the defense of other islands such as Kimu, Matsu, etc. A Taiwanese paper wrote, obviously the Chinese government's decision to evacuate those islands was a most painful one. The Taiwan Islands has always remained in the hands of the government forces, despite the seizure of the mainland by the communists. They were not only listening posts for obtaining information concerning conditions on the mainland, but were also expected to serve as springboards for launching the final counterattack against the Taiping regime. Millions of dollars have been spent for their fortification, and the garrison forces stationed there by the government were determined to fight to the bitter end to defend them against the threatened communist invasion. The Chinese government, therefore, would not have ordered the evacuation of the Taiwan Islands if it was not considered a wise step to take with reference to the overall situation. This decision, however, created an interesting problem. The ROC would need to evacuate some 25,000 troops and civilians, as well as tons of military equipment. For that, they needed the United States. Giesings continues. The State Department in Washington had announced on February 5th that at the request of the Chinese nationalists, the U.S. 7th Fleet had been ordered to help in the evacuation of the Taichans. Bruce Ellman of Columbia University explains the scale of the undertaking in his 2021 book, Taiwan Straits Standoff. The February 8 to 11th, 1955 evacuation of the Taichans was a massive undertaking. The USN used a total of 132 ships and 400 aircraft to evacuate 14,500 civilians, 10,000 nationalist troops, and approximately 4,000 guerrilla fighters, along with over 40,000 tons of military equipment and supplies. It was a mammoth undertaking, as reflected in the name of the operation, Operation King Kong. The New York Times reported preparations are being made by United States officials here for the 7th Fleet assistance in withdrawing Chinese nationalist troops from the Taiwan Islands. The evacuation would eventually involve 142 ships and over 400 aircraft. The Times wrote, Admiral Pride left Hong Kong aboard the cruiser Helena. A reliable source said he was here for an assessment of the evacuation problem. The problem involves evacuation of possibly 30,000 persons, along with military equipment from the Taichung area. It is a problem that is obviously complicated by the fact that the Taichungs are within range of the Chinese Communist Air Force and island-based artillery. The Times continued. Dispatches from Manila indicate ships on the move towards the East China Sea area include the aircraft carriers Essex, Yorktown, and Kearsarge. BBC reported U.S. Task Force 77, including 5 aircraft carriers, is on hand to counter what its commander, Admiral Ring, calls sneak attacks by the Chinese Communists. In addition to the carriers the Times listed were the Wasp and the Midway. The escort force included the heavy cruisers USS Pittsburgh, Toledo, and Helena, 13 destroyers, the amphibious force command ship USS Estes, and numerous landing ships, docks, and cargo vessels. A project of that scale faced its difficulties. The New York Times reported earlier rains interfered with loading. Nationalist soldiers, who are doing virtually all the loading, trudged through ankle-deep mud from cargo assembly points to the beaches and up ramps to boats. United States beach masters, Marine shore parties, and Army advisors were with the Chinese through the cold and miserable night. Floodlights used to illuminate the beaches for night loading operations could be seen for miles. Ellman writes that while protecting the Taiwan evacuation was up to the Navy, the U.S. Army was put in charge of the actual evacuation of civilians, guerrillas, and military personnel, plus destroying anything of value. The Times reported that on the Taiwan, demolition teams were blowing up military positions. The Chinese also were burning houses. Black smoke from fires rose over the islands, and ditches ran with burning gasoline. Fires from burning houses and demolitions were clearly visible at sea. BBC reported after sweeping the straits for mines, the American fleet began the mass movement of people 2 days ago. The first group they rescued, on board the 16-ton transporter Henrico, consisted of approximately 100 over 65-year-olds. But despite the fears of sneak attacks, BBC notes communist forces have not interfered with the transportation process. Keesings reports that the only incident occurred on February 9th, when a U.S. plane on anti-submarine patrol was shot down by communist anti-aircraft fire some 20 miles southwest of the Taichans. Another plane was hit but landed safely. Vice Admiral Pride announced after the incident that the lost aircraft, whose crew was rescued by an American destroyer, had made an error in navigation. And the Times reported that the commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet said today that the Navy would not retaliate for the shooting down of a plane along the East China coast. The 3-person crew of the Douglas Sky Raider, they wrote, escaped with minor cuts and bruises. Otherwise, the evacuation went smoothly. While the evacuees were taken to Taiwan, many of the troops were sent to defend Quemoy and Matsu. Despite PRC attacks, Quemoy and Matsu were successfully defended. Newman writes, as the United States and Taiwan continued to resupply the islands into October, Chinese shelling tailed off. In the end, neither side chose to escalate. While the first Taiwan Strait crisis is well remembered, Operation King Kong is much less so. The University of Nottingham Taiwan Research Hub writes, the retreat was the final and thus most recent retreat of the nationalists, which solidified the borders of the PRC and ROC as they exist today. From the Taichung deity they honor to their cuisine, their local customs are distinct from the various communities living in Taiwan. Before 1955, these islands were still under ROC control. Those living there before 1955 relocated to Taiwan, and this island chain's story, the lost outlying island, has been forgotten by Taiwanese there. But they faced difficulty, the Hub explains. After being forced to evacuate their hometown, many tried hard to make a new home in Taiwan, the so-called New Heaven for the Taichung people. This was not always easy. Taichung people had their own fishery technique, culture, and language. Many chose instead to relocate to the United States, where the Hub writes, many Chechen people started their own businesses, the most common of which were Chinese restaurants. The website New York Food's Story writes, these Taiwanese restaurateurs changed New York's Chinese food landscape. They opened restaurants throughout the city, broadened our knowledge of Chinese regional cuisine, and made important innovation in New York's restaurant business, pioneering photographic menus and food delivery. Dulles argued in an op-ed in Life magazine that the administration's handling of the crisis was a successful example of brinksmanship, and the U.S. argued that by peacefully evacuating the Taichung Islands, we had reduced tensions. But Chang argues that war was more avoided because of Chinese communist caution than because of Dulles and Eisenhower's diplomatic skills. In any case, so many tensions were left unresolved that there was a second Taiwan Strait crisis just 3 years later, and perhaps worse, some historians argue that Eisenhower's threat to use nuclear weapons is what spurred Mao and the PRC to begin their own nuclear program. And of course, today, there's still a very real risk of war over Taiwan and China. But for the people of the Taichung Islands, Operation King Kong meant that they were forced to abandon their culture, their homes, their ancestral homeland. Forgotten victims of the Cold War. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.